Dawn pressed a pale stripe through the slit of the stone cell, and Mateo Rojas knew the day had arrived. He lay still on the straw and listened. The gulls beyond the fortress walls, the creak of rigging on a ship he could not see, the muted bells of Havana waking to market. Cold iron circled his wrists. He felt the rough kiss of the red scarf he had kept since his first voyage, now faded and salt-stiff against his neck. He did not pray aloud. He counted his breaths like knots on a line and let the sea climb in his mind, wave after wave, steady and indifferent. Somewhere along the corridor, a key jangled and boots whispered. He sat up and shook straw from his hair, tracing the small scar on his cheek that had carried more stories than it deserved. He thought of the crew behind other doors, men who had followed him into storms and into folly. He wondered if courage could be shared across stone. The day would be long. He decided to hold it like a compass, one point fixed on the horizon he could not see but still felt. Sleep had broken into fragments through the night, each fragment wrapped around the same memory. Canvas, slamming full, the Spanish frigate cutting wind clean as a blade, the white wake like chalk on blue stone. He had stood at his quarterdeck then, jaw tight, watching the distance shrink. The San Isidro had carried more guns and better men. He had known it in his bones and steered anyway. He had told himself the shoals would favor his shallower draft. He had told himself luck owed him one more dawn. When the first broadside came, it tore through his thoughts and pitched him hard against the rail. He could still taste the smoke if he tucked his tongue against a molar. Later, after the rigging fell and the sea turned a darker shade beneath them, he had looked across at the Spanish captain and seen no gloat in the man's face, only a ledger being balanced. The memory stung and steadied him at once. He owned it. He folded it away like a map that had already been read. The door scraped and a guard entered with a tin cup and a heel of bread. Behind him came Capitan Morales, the same measured gaze, the same blue and gold coat without a speck of salt. The smell of clove and old leather clung to him. Mateo rose as far as his chains allowed. Morales studied the room, then the man. The captain's words were formal and spare, spoken in a voice that belonged to orders and weather. Mateo heard what mattered beneath them, the hour fixed, the place in the square, the soldiers who would stand between the crowd and the condemned. No sermon, no cruelty, just a plank set across a span. Morales did not linger. He gave a brief nod, the smallest recognition that one mariner gave another when the sea decided. When the guard withdrew, Mateo drank slowly, feeling the water wake his mouth. He broke the bread and set half aside for later, an old habit he did not need anymore, but could not set down. He found his balance again in the absence Morales left, a cleared space in which to stand. From beyond the wall came a cough he knew belonged to Kerrigan, the one-eyed gunner with hands like knots. A softer scrape signaled young Nico shifting on his pallet. Mateo spoke low, careful to keep his voice steady. He named the morning, the sun already climbing, the smell of the harbor, the way gulls sounded like laughter when they wheeled high. He told them the line would hold if they held it, that a single breath could be a harbor if they let it be. He could not hear every answer through the stone, but he felt the hush that follows a rope drawn tight. He pictured each face in the shadows and placed a hand on the wall as if his palm could cross through. He remembered the rhythm of their boots on deck, the way they had moved as if their bodies were a single ship. If fear rose in him, he set it down gently and let it sit beside him like an old friend who had earned a seat. Today, he would keep his crew inside the reach of his voice as long as the day allowed. Near mid-morning, a friar in a brown habit arrived, his sandals whispering over the stones. Fray Tomas carried no judgment Mateo could see, only a wooden cross worn smooth by fingers. He offered a chair he did not have, and patience he had carried a long way. Mateo had been a child in a church once, small and restless under saints who watched from frames dim with smoke. He remembered how the priest's words then had felt like rain on tile. Now he looked at the friar's lined face and weighted his silence against the clamor inside. He spoke of what lay heavy, a boy left adrift on a raft of his own anger, then a man who learned to steer by hunger and wind. He spoke of the men he had hurt when the sea became a narrow road and a purse grew wider than mercy. The friar listened and asked little. When he did speak, he spoke of turning toward a light, even in a storm, a turning measured not by perfect charts, but by stubborn repetition. Matteo did not ask forgiveness as a bargain. He set his sorrow down like ballast and felt the hull settle, less likely to capsize in the day's last gusts. A thin clerk with ink-stained fingers came next, the sort of man who knew how to keep names from slipping away. He unrolled a paper and dipped his quill. He asked for origins, ages, places where wind had first braided itself into their hair. Matteo gave the names he had used at sea, and then, after a pause that felt like stepping from a skiff to a ship, he gave the one his mother had spoken when he was small. He watched the letters form, black strokes that carried more than they revealed. He offered the clerk a list of his crew and a note to any kin who might be found. There were few. He did not embellish their work with grandness. He asked that they be remembered for how they stood together when the deck rolled and the sky fell, and for how they shared the last of any water. The clerk nodded and blew the ink dry. Matteo felt oddly anchored by the scratch and lift of the quill, as if the day had drawn a line that would keep their names from drifting. Left alone again, Matteo leaned back and let the room dim into a different kind of sea. In the quiet, he wrote a letter he would never send, line by line inside his skull. He wrote to the horizon that had kept him company, to the wind that had held his coat open like a second set of hands, to the lantern light on a calm night when the deck seemed to float over stars. He thanked the boy he had been for stubbornness, and he warned him what that stubbornness could cost if left unchecked. He named the faces of his crew one by one and told them what he had failed to say aloud enough, that leadership had been, at its best, a promise to listen. He did not ask the sea to remember him. It remembered nothing and everything, and that was part of its mercy. When he opened his eyes, the cell looked the same and yet felt larger, like a cabin after a gale when the air loses its knife edge. Near noon, the guards brought a bowl of stew and a coarse loaf. The smell was ordinary and comforting, onions and something salted. Matteo tasted a spoonful and then set the bowl by the bars, asking the guard with a nod to pass it to the next cell. He kept a heel of bread and tucked it in his coat, more ritual than hunger. He made certain the boy received enough and imagined Nico swallowing as if the food might vanish if he did not keep pace. He ate slowly and listened for the scrape of bowls on stone along the row, each sound a proof of life. He remembered sharing little feasts on deck after a storm, hardtack softened in rum, a strip of fruit passed hand to hand. He had always told himself he would do better at the next port. He found a wry smile at that. Ports had a way of receding. He drank the last of the water and felt it settle into a hunger that was not for food. When they came for him in the afternoon, the corridor breathed cool air that smelled faintly of lime wash and the harbor. Shackles at ankles, shackles at wrists, he rose and let the links teach him a slower step. The guards did not hurry him. He counted each arch as they passed beneath, the fortress a puzzle he would never solve. And then they emerged into light. Havana spread in terraces of white and ochre, roofs like the backs of sleeping animals, the sea intense and near. People had gathered where shadows offered a view. He saw a woman pressing a cloth to her mouth, a boy in a shirt too large, a sailor with arms folded as if bracing in a swell. Drums started, a low heartbeat that gathered feet into marching. Matteo lifted his chin so he could see the slice of blue between clouds and watched a pair of frigate birds carve careless loops he envied. There was no haste in him now, only the sense that every step could still be chosen. The scaffold stood at the edge of the square where the wind found it easily. Timber beams creaked, ropes hanging with a calm that unsettled more than motion might have. Capitan Morales waited there, hat beneath his arm, a priest to one side and a clerk to the other, as if the moment required witness from three branches of life. The sentence was read in a voice the square could hear, shaped to carry but not to wound. Matteo listened as if to weather, to be sure of the direction and force. He looked to the side and found his crew, each man held by a soldier, faces pared down to bone and intention. He saw Kerrigan's one eye bright with a kind of crooked pride and Nico's throat bobbing as he swallowed. He lifted his hands, as much as the irons allowed, not to plead, but to let them see they were not alone in the light. The crowd shifted, a human tide making room for something that had to pass. The priest stepped forward with a final offering of words and touch, and Matteo accepted a blessing on his forehead that felt like cool water. A guard lifted a cloth as if to shield his eyes, and Matteo considered it. He chose to see. He asked only that he face the sea if the ropes allowed. Morales agreed with a tilt of his hand, a practical kindness. Matteo turned so that the horizon cut clean across his vision, a straight measure to hold. The wood beneath his boots felt new, the kind of timber shipwrights saved for keels. He wondered whose hands had planed it smooth and whether they had thought of storms as they worked. He breathed in salt and tar and the distant sour of citrus rind. He allowed his shoulders to settle. Words felt small now, smaller even than breath. What he could give his crew and himself was steadiness. He kept his mouth soft, his eyes open, his anger quiet, and his courage without show. Time thinned. Sound sharpened. He could pick from the air the rasp of a gull's wing and the click of a buckle 2 paces behind him. He thought of a cove he had once found on a chartless island, water as still as glass and ringed with mangroves that sang when wind slipped through them. He let that quiet into his bones. He glanced once toward his crew and met each gaze in turn, not to trap them but to release them, a shared nod that said the ship had been worth the miles and the mistakes. He felt the rope brushed against his shoulder, rough as unspun hemp on his skin. He thought then not of gold or battles, but of small things that had outlasted both. The way pitch warmed and smelled like summer, the clack of dice in a tin cup, the first rain after a long passage. He stood ready, not as a hero in a tale, but as a man who had steered his share and accepted the reefs where he found them. When the command moved down the line like a breeze that becomes wind, Matteo lifted his chin a fraction to keep the sea centered. He felt the world gather itself, the square holding one long breath. Within that breath, a memory rose without warning. His mother at a table near a window, light braiding itself through her hair as she kneaded dough, the smell of warm wheat and ash. She had looked up once and smiled without questions, as if she had seen the shape of all his days and decided to love them anyway. He let that memory stand beside him. He did not push it away. He set his heel the way a helmsman sets the rudder against a cross sea. His mouth formed a single silent word, not a plea but a thank you that had finally found its harbor. The wind lifted his scarf and set it down again like a flag struck at sunset. He did not feel himself separate from the day so much as return to it, a tide creeping back over sand it had always owned. The square blurred at the edges. The sea held its line, blue and unblinking. Matteo kept his balance as long as balance had meaning. When it slipped, he did not chase it. He let the wind do its work and entrusted the rest to hands he could no longer name. His last measure was simple and clean, a horizon, a breath, and the knowledge that he had kept faith with his men in the only way left to him. The world dimmed like a lantern turned low. Somewhere a gull laughed, or perhaps it was only the air emptying of sound. He imagined a deck under him, dry and well caulked, and the faintest lift of a swell carrying the whole forward. He rode that imagined motion and let the day close around him like calm water, still and complete.